Good evening. Delando Dyer once again, Christ Life TV Ministries, coming back again with another installment in the Proverbs series. This time we're in chapter 5, which is titled Sexual Pitfalls. It's very common in the history of mankind and even in modern times where this is not a new topic. It's unfortunately too common and sometimes not taken very seriously, whether those outside of the church or sometimes within the church. Or in some cases, there are people who take marriage more seriously outside the church than in some cases, tragically, those within the church. But once again, we're going to look at the scriptures, we're going to look at what the Bible says, and prayerfully get wisdom from these scriptures so that we can be able to teach, and not only teach being hearers of the word, but also doing and applying that to our own lives. So nevertheless, here we go. Same format as before. I will read the topic of the outline or the subject of the outline, and I will read those verses that correspond to it. So here we go. Starting at verses 1 and 2, again, we have a call to attention. My son, give attention to my wisdom, incline your ear to my understanding, that you may observe discretion, and your lips may reserve knowledge. Now, just as in chapter 4 and the previous chapters, we see the call from the father for the son or for that child to take heed, to pay attention, to listen. That's always important, and we've emphasized this as we did on the last video, so I'm not going to rehash it per se or go over it again. But just remember, he wants his child's undivided attention. So we'll leave it at that, and we'll go to the next verse. Verse 3. The allure of an immoral woman. For the lips of an adulteress drip honey, and smoother than oil is her speech. Well, let's just stop here for a minute. We're not talking about all women here, or he's not talking about all women here for starters. He's talking about an adulteress. An adulteress in this context is one who either A, is a married woman who does not respect her covenant of marriage and goes out of her covenant of marriage in order to be with somebody else, or B, a woman who is not married to someone else and does not respect the covenant of marriage and is willing to be in sexual relations with another man that is married, or even in the cases not married, because if she really respected him, she would want to be married to him or married to someone who wants to be married to her. And that does not leave the man off the hook, by the way. And we'll get into that later on in this chapter. Also, notice the characteristics of this adulterous woman. It talks about how the lips of an adulteress drip honey. Notice the visual words that are being used, the imagery that's being used. Honey, again, is sweet. It tastes good. And in some cases, depending on what you put it on, like food or whatnot, it looks good. It's visually appealing to one's eyes. Just like for many men, most men who are attracted to the opposite sex, that is, we're attracted by what we see. Next up, smoother than oil is her speech. Back in the days when I was young, 80s, I believe there was a song called Smooth Operator. I believe it was talking about a guy, but basically it talks about how smooth that person's speech was. In some terms in the 90s, someone who would kick game, or he has game. He has all the right words to say, or in this case, she has the right words to say. She knows what to say. So not only does this woman have a physical attraction to her, but also has the words to say to grab and keep that person's attention. But that doesn't stop there. Verses 4 through 7, the danger of the immoral woman. But in the end, she is bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Her feet go down to death. Her steps take hold of Sheol. She does not ponder the path of life. Her ways are unstable. She does not know it. Now then, my sons, listen to me, and do not depart from the words of my mouth. All right, let's get this started. See the contrast here with the visuals? Remember, her mouth was dripping like, or looked and dripped like honey, and her speech was as smooth as oil. Well, look at the contrast here starting in verse 4. Excuse me for a second. But in the end, she is bitter. She is as bitter as wormwood, sharp as a two-edged sword. Now, for those who may not be aware, wormwood is a type of plant that has a some type of it gives off an aroma, but it is bitter in taste. Although it is has medicinal properties, in other words, it's good for anti-inflammation and other healing properties. To taste it gives a bitterness in one's mouth. Remember that the contrast, honey, but when you finally get it or get what you've been desiring, it's not honey anymore, it's wormwood. Before, the speech was smooth as oil, but now she's as sharp as a two-edged sword. Smooth, sharp, contrast. So her path does not lead to anywhere good. If we look at verse 5, her feet go down to death. That's blatantly obvious that you don't want to go down that path. The righteous path leads to a path of life. The wicked path leads to death. This is not to say that we'll never experience death one day, because the Bible says that there's a point for man to die once and afterwards judgment. However, the death that someone pursues by following this path of an immoral woman can put somebody in an early grave, possibly shorten their life longer than what they could have lived, shorten their life longer than what they could have been, lived, or it could put them in a pathway where you die, and then ultimately you gotta face God for unrepentant sin. I would not advise anybody to be in either one of those categories. But also, let's look again. Her steps take hold of Sheol. This is not per se talking about someone going to hell, but Sheol is used in the Old Testament to talk about the grave. Verse 6, she has not pondered the path of life. Her ways are unstable. She does not know it. Now, keep in mind, for those who are one to follow Christ and follow a godly path, you're going to ponder what steps you're taking in life. This person is described as not pondering the path of life. Her ways are unstable. She does not know it. If she doesn't know that the path that she's taking is leading her to her own death, for the one who's being tempted, what makes you or I think that they're going to care about where they're taking you down the path in life? If they're about to go off a bridge, but they're not pondering that they're about to go off a one-way trip to death, what makes you think that they're going to give you a heads up if they're not even concerned about their own path? And again, not to make this look like a one-sided argument, even though a father is talking to his son, women, please take heed of the same thing. If a guy has speech smoother than oil and his lips drip like honey per se, or looks good, looks attractive, but that person is not willing to follow Christ, don't pursue that person. Don't pursue that man. Because what if that person pursues you, you pursue that person, excuse me, and they lead you down an ungodly path, and you end up experiencing the same wormwood and two-edged sword that the man in this chapter is being described as about to have as his reward. And again, we see in verse 7, he's urging his sons. Well, he says, my sons, actually, listen to me. Do not depart from the words of my mouth. He's again trying to get that focus, that attention. Like if I'm talking to you who's looking at me right now, listen to me. Don't ignore this. Then starting at verse 8 through 14, the ruin of adultery. Keep your way far from her, and do not go near the door of her house, or you will give your vigor to others, and your years to the cruel one, and strangers will be filled with your strength, and your hard-earned goods will go to the house of an alien, that is, foreigner, and you groan at your final end, when your flesh and your body are consumed, and you say, how I've hated instruction, and my heart spurned reproof. I have not listened to the voice of my teachers, nor incline my ear to my instructors. I was almost in utter ruin in the midst of the congregation and assembly. Because Solomon more than likely learned from his father's mistakes, remember King David and Bathsheba and the price he had to pay for that, Remember the sword not departing from his household. Remember those things? Yeah, because he saw what his father went through, and it's very possible because of what he went through when he as in Solomon took 700 wives, 300 concubines, and all these women led his heart away from God to serve other gods. Solomon would not be Solomon would be in the best position to tell his son, don't go down this path. One, because your grandfather went down this path and you see where it took him. And if you haven't noticed, my life wasn't the same when I pursued that path. And one thing I do take into consideration, at least he owns up, or at least he tells him that because he wants his son to own up to whatever he does in life, not making excuses, not saying, well, it's that woman. Sounds like Genesis chapter 3. Remember that woman you gave me? No. Look in the mirror, take accountability, own up to it, repent, and move forward. Prayerfully, we have time to do that if we're in that situation, or just don't get involved in it at all. But let's look at some of the ruins that come from this adulterous pursuit. It says in verse 9, or you'll give your vigor to others. Now, some versions will say honor. And honor is everything in ancient Near Eastern culture, and honor is very big today, even though we may not think about it. Or we'll put it another way, your reputation. If you lose your reputation, your name, what good does it do? If you're known as someone who does not respect another person's marriage, another person's covenant that they have with another person under God, and you're willing to pursue that person's spouse, what makes the next couple think that you're going to respect their covenant and you may not try to pursue that wife or that husband? That's, and another thing that comes with honor, trust. If the spouse of that adulterer doesn't have trust for him or for her, what makes you think someone else is going to trust him or her as well? Especially if that person pursued another. Let's put it this way: if you have one couple whose marriage has been affected because someone they both knew pursued the wife or pursued the husband, and now you just violated that household, that covenant, that trust, why would they trust you? And what makes you think it stops there? Because it can go a lot further. Let's look at verse 13. I'm sorry, verse 9 again. In your year, you give your vigor to others, and your years to the cruel one. It's not just a temporary consequence. It's not just a one and done. It can last for years. Let's think about some of the things that can come about from adultery, especially in marriage. You have the possibility of divorce. That's very not just financially costly, but it could be um, spiritually draining, mentally affecting people. Oh, yeah, we forgot to mention children can be involved as well. So when you have children involved, how do you think the children are going to feel when they were in a household with mommy and daddy, and now mommy and daddy are separating, where mommy's leaving the household or daddy's leaving the household because of a situation beyond their control? You think that doesn't affect the children also? Furthermore, let's think about this, not just the divorce, not just how it affects the children, but what about child support? What if a child comes out of this one time or multiple times of committing adultery? And now you have 18 years worth of supporting a child who didn't ask to be here, and nor should that be an advocate, being a, what's it called, an excuse or a reason to abort the child. As you know from this channel and from our numerous videos, we don't give leeway for that. Biblically, no, because the child is not the sin. So we're not even going to go there and say that. But again, abortion could be one of those consequences because there have been only Lord knows how many cases where abortion has been put on the table and has been paid for because because individuals try to hide the sin that was being committed. And sometimes even when abortion is gone through, is the decision of abortion is done, it's still found out. So yeah, it's very costly and it's very damaging. Also, I almost forgot STDs. Yeah, some things can last temporarily. Some things can also last with you a lifetime, all because of this pursuit for something that was not worth it, especially if you have to live with it for the rest of your natural life. But also looking at verse 10, and strangers will be filled with your strength, and your hard earned goods will go to the house of an alien. And again, I interjected in that reading alien meaning a foreigner, someone outside of your family, someone that does not know the God that you profess to serve. And if you think about again, well, we already said child support, so we'll leave it at that. But someone having legal right to what you earn because you pursued somebody that you really didn't know. But then look at the tragedy in verse 11. And you groan at your final end when your flesh and your body are consumed. And you say, how I have hated instruction and my heart spurned reproof. I have not listened to the voice of my teachers, nor inclined my ear to my instructors. I was almost in utter ruin in the midst of the assembly and congregation. Take note, the physical aspects of it in verse 11 where the flesh and body were consumed. Take note in verse 12 that the person, verses 12 through 14, this person is in deep regret because he knew he had wisdom given to him, but he, verse 12, hated instruction. Verse 12 again, he spurned reproof, that is correction. Verse 13, when you know how we've been talking about listening and paying attention. Verse 13, he admits he did not listen to the voice of his teachers. He didn't incline his ears. That that's implying that you're putting your ear in a certain direction. He didn't put it towards the words of his instructors. And then in verse 14, just so people don't think that it's a private matter, verse 14 says that he was almost in utter ruin in the midst of the assembly and congregation. It is a public finding out. I mean, why do you think we have um so many shows? TV One, Fatal Attraction, Fatal Affairs, Murderous Affairs, For My Man, For My Woman, all these different shows. Because in many cases, especially the ones we're talking about married couples, there are so many cases where someone stepped outside of the marriage, pursued something that was exciting and new and exhilarating, only to end up in a path that they did not imagine they would be in. And in some cases, they were either caught up to their death, they're either serving a sentence longer than their life is going to ever be, or they can be serving a life sentence, or they end up hurting somebody else in the end that they had no intention on hurting, all because they wanted to pursue a different path. But again, we're going to look at not the bright side, we're going to look at the flip side of this. Instead of following that path of immorality, if you are married, finding satisfaction for husbands, find satisfaction with your own wife. Verses 15 through 23. And we're going to start with 15 through 19. God's provision in marriage. Drink water from your own cistern and fresh water from your own well. Should your springs be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the streets, let them be yours alone, and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed, and rejoice in the wife of your youth. As a loving hind and a graceful doe, let her breast satisfy you at all times. Be exhilarated always with her love. Now notice, well, actually, let's go back up. Drink water from your own cistern. Now, because of the times we live in, if you're in the states or in other modern cities and or countries and cities, we may not understand fully what a cistern is. It's similar. It's kind of like a well, but it's like an ancient. Well, actually, it's an ancient artificial reservoir used for water storage. Sometimes it could be up on the rooftops, and sometimes it could be underground. And it's a very valuable resource that people in this culture would have had because they can keep water stored and they can have it for their own personal or household use. So, with that in mind, going back to verse 15, what is he saying? He's saying basically don't go to someone else's cistern. I mean, if you want to think about it in explicit terms, you can pretty much fill in the blanks from this point. If it's a man talking to another man that will one day be married, drink water from your own cistern and fresh water from your own well. Just as a husband should love his own wife and the wife should respect her own husband, you notice how that ownership is coming in, not love someone else's wife or respect someone else's husband. It needs to be one to one. Husband, wife, those two are locked together. They need to be with each other. Don't go out abroad. Because look what it says in verse 16. Should your springs be dispersed abroad, streams of water in the streets, kind of like being a free spirit, just, free for all? No, that's not how it should be. The answer, rhetorically speaking, is no. 17, let them be yours alone and not for strangers with you. Let your fountain be blessed and rejoice in the wife of your youth. Let it be you and the wife that you married, the wife that God is giving you to be with. And I know that a lot of times there's the temptation of, well, things are not going well, or, we going through this, we're going through that, or she doesn't look like this person. Well, first and foremost, focus on your wife. I don't look the same way. I probably said this before somewhere along the line. I don't look the same way I looked when I was 22. So people change in time. But if all you're dealing with is the physical attributes, what happens if something goes wrong with her physical looks or your physical looks? I hope that's not what's keeping the marriage together. Because if that's the case, then yeah, you're going to be prone to look in another direction, but that doesn't give you an excuse to do so either. And nor will that be an excuse for when the consequences come. But look at verse 19. As a loving hind, a graceful doe, let her breast satisfy you at all times. Be exhilarated always with her love. There's a certain satisfaction that comes with being in intimacy with your own wife that can't be with another woman that's not your wife. And that's speaking as a man before marriage and a man being married. Not a no, that's actually what it is. There's no shame and no guilt with being intimate with my own wife versus before I got married. If you think about in the book of Genesis where it says the man and his wife Adam and Eve were naked and were not ashamed before sin came into the picture, because there's a sense of that when you're with your spouse, with your wife, husband with their wife, wife with their own husband, that when you two are come together in that intimacy as God intended it, that you understand how there's that joy that comes with that. There's that pleasure that comes, but it comes being under God's will versus being outside of his will. Verses 20 through 23, the destiny of an adulterer, going back again to what the end of an adulterous path is. For why should you, my son, be exhilarated with an adulteress and embrace the bosom of a foreigner? For the ways of a man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he watches all his paths. His own iniquities will capture the wicked, and he will be held with the cords of his sin. He will die for lack of instruction, and in the greatness of his folly he will go astray. Notice in verse 19 where it says to be exhilarated always with her love, meaning your wife's love. And then it goes right into the contrast in verse 20. It says, "For why should you, my son, be exhilarated with an adulteress?" After it's given all those pictures of a hind and a doe, and be with the wife of your youth, and have your own cistern, your own well. And then verse 20 says, "Why should you be in the bosom of a foreigner, someone who's not your wife? Why should you be exhilarated with an adulteress?" Verse 21, for the ways, I'm sorry. So verse 21 answers this question. "For the ways of the man are before the eyes of the Lord, and he watches all his paths." This is not the first time that men have been put in this position, and unfortunately, until Christ comes, it won't be the last. Do you think that you have a foolproof way of being in adultery and not getting caught? Do you think you have a foolproof way of stepping on this unrighteous path and it not affect you in any way whatsoever? And we're going to see in another chapter where this is talked about again, but it's always the emphasis of, if you go down this path, it's not going to end the way you think. And the pleasure that you think you're going to get, or the pleasure you do get from that, is not going to even be remotely close to the amount of pain that's going to cause you and others. And then in verse 22, it really gives a summation of everything that happens. 22 and 23, excuse me. Excuse me. It says, "His own iniquities, sins, will capture the wicked, and he will be held with the cords of his sin." It's like a self-inflicted trap, basically. Verse 23, "He will die for lack of instruction, and in the greatness of his folly, he will go astray." So this path that one pursues, if someone does choose to do it, it will lead them into a trap. It will be self-inflicted, and it will be death that comes with it. Why? Because they did not want to listen to instructions. They did not want to not only listen, but take heed and follow instructions. And this is something that, as married men and married women, that's something we should be on guard for. And some may wonder, well, what if my marriage is not, what if we're going through problems? What if we're going through situations where I can't talk to this person? Then I would suggest, and I would implore you, beg you, to seek godly counsel and to not look for other means of escape. Because I can almost promise you this: if you pursue other means of, I wouldn't say pursuing other means, I would say trying to escape or get away, then you may end up finding yourself in the same situation. You may end up finding yourself trying to escape or being able to talk to someone of the opposite sex a lot easier than you can talk to your own wife. And as easy as that may seem, as beneficial as that may seem, that can even be detrimental, because if you're able to talk to this person easier, what if you're drawn to that person just as easy? What if that other person is drawn to you? And that brings a plethora of problems as well. So the prayer that we do have is that if there are problems, seek it out together, pray, seek godly counsel, but do not go down this ungodly path that we have seen so much misery, destruction, and death, all because of the lack of following God's instructions. And I pray that something that was said and something that is in this chapter would resonate with you, would stick with you, that you would pursue him with your whole heart. I pray and ask that if there's anything that you get from this, please leave a like, a comment, share this with somebody else, subscribe to this channel so you can get the latest updated content on this series and other topics. And any suggestions that you may have, please leave that in the comment section as well. And until then, please stay vigilant. Good night. God bless.
I'm living that Christ life, that right life, that holy life, a God-fearing life, because I want to have eternal life. See that double life? It's the wrong life. It brings a lot of strife, then you find yourself living that hell life.